This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Final Fantasy by using my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone. Earlier today, the entire card gallery for Magic the Gathering Final Fantasy dropped, and that means it's time to start my limited set review. Over the next several days, I'll give my thoughts on every single card in the set and how I think it'll perform in the limited format, and we're starting with a look at the multicolored and colorless cards. This is always a fun place to start because multicolored cards tend to introduce us to the format's two color archetypes, and they also tend to be some of the most powerful cards in the set. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be looking at cards that can be found in play boosters. This set has lots of supplemental products that have cards that won't be showing up in play boosters, like cards from the starter pack or commander decks. So if there's a card you think is missing from this video, it's probably not in play boosters. There is one subset of cards that is in play boosters that I'm not going to cover in this video, and that is this set's bonus sheet. Once I get through the main set, the bonus sheet will have its own video. These are also my evaluations of these cards before it's possible to play this format, since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at all the colorless and multicolored cards in Final Fantasy. We're going to start with a couple of cards that are colorless and not artifacts, the first of those being Summon Bahamut. It is 9 generic mana for an enchantment creature Saga Dragon. This is one of the big new mechanics in this set where you have sagas that are also creatures. This one's a 9/9 flyer. Chapter 1 and 2 say destroy up to one target non-land permanent. Chapter 3 says draw 2 cards. And Chapter 4 has this creature deal damage equal to the total mana value of other permanents you control to each opponent. So these summon saga creatures are interesting because they bring along with them the value that sagas normally have, but they also have the downside that most sagas have, and that is when you reach the last chapter, you sacrifice it. So there is an expiration date on this creature. And this particular one is super expensive, but it does deliver serious value right away since you add a big scary body to the board and get rid of your opponent's best permanent, and then on the next turn it can attack and do it again. Chances are if it sticks around, you're just going to win between the cards, the destruction, the damage, and even if your opponent kills it, they'll be behind in a lot of ways. But 9 mana is just too much for most limited formats. 8 is usually the upper limit of a card you can consistently cast, even in most ramp decks, and even that is too much in some formats. In most games of limited Magic, you just don't get there, and that makes me really temper my expectations on this card. That said, this set does have a decent amount of ramp. Green has lots of cards that let you ramp, and there's a mana rock that can tap for 2 colorless, so I think this is going to be viable in some small number of decks. I do think this is just a straight up F in most decks in the format though because it's just too expensive. But I think it has a ceiling of a B in really good ramp decks, and obviously when you cast it, it will feel like an A, but even in a ramp deck, something this expensive will just get stuck in your hand too often for it to be completely insane. Next up, it's Ultima, Origin of Oblivion, which for 5 generic mana is a 4/4 legendary god at rare. It's got flying, and when it attacks, you put a blight counter on target land. For as long as that land has a blight counter on it, it loses all land types and abilities, and has tap, add colorless. Whenever you tap a land for colorless, add an additional colorless. So this doesn't really feel like it's here for limited. Nerfing a land is rarely relevant on turn 6 when this can attack, and it's not like you have the Tron lands or anything to really take advantage of the extra mana. You can target your own land with Ultima's blight counters, at which point they do tap for more mana, so he can provide ramp in a way, but generally he's just a 5 mana 4/4 flyer with some small upside that most of the time won't amount to anything in limited, and these days a 5 mana 4/4 flyer just isn't what it used to be. You usually need some upside on a card like that for it to actually be something exciting, and I don't think this really gets there just because the upside it does have is so often irrelevant or minimal. So I think it's just a C. Alright, let's move to the multicolored cards now, starting with Absolute Virtue, which for 6 generic, a white and a blue, is an 8/8 legendary avatar warrior at Mythic Rare. It can't be countered, it has flying, and it gives you protection from each of your opponents, which means you can't be dealt damage, enchanted, or targeted by anything controlled by your opponents. As someone who played Final Fantasy XI for a couple of years back in the mid-aughts, I'm pretty disappointed in this card. It's mostly just a big French vanilla creature. It would be way better if it had some form of protection for itself, but as it is, it's just a big old flyer for 8 mana. Okay, I'm underselling it. It does also make it so you don't have to block and your opponent's attacks don't really matter because their creatures can't damage you, which is great, but your opponent can still take down Absolute Virtue with a whole lot of very cheap common removal in this set. And that's really bad news on an 8-drop that doesn't give you any fail case value at all. In other words, it doesn't have an interest trigger or a death trigger. So if they kill it, it's dead, and you have nothing to show for it. So sadly, I think this is probably just a D. Next up, it's Balthier and Fran, which for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 4/3 legendary human rabbit at rare. It's got reach. Vehicles you control get +1/+1 and have vigilance and reach. And whenever a vehicle crewed by Balthier and Fran this turn attacks, if it's the first combat phase of the turn, you could pay 1 generic, a red and a green, and if you do, after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So this format does have some vehicles, but there's not like a vehicle deck. There's not a color pair that's really into vehicles, and there aren't really enough of them in the set that this upside is going to be amazing. So a lot of the time, this is just a 3 mana 4/3 with reach, and it will occasionally be better than that because you have a vehicle or two. Extra combat phases really aren't that easy to take advantage of, especially one that doesn't untap your stuff. Your vehicles do have vigilance, so in theory your vehicle would be able to attack again, but if none of your other creatures are able to do it, it's usually not that exciting, especially because you have to sink mana into it to get that extra combat phase. So I think this is just a C+ overall. Next up, it's Black Waltz number 3, which for 2 generic, a black and a red, is a 2/2 legendary wizard at uncommon. It's got flying and death touch. Whenever you cast it on creature spell, Black Waltz number 3 deals 2 damage to each opponent. So this is one of the signpost uncommons for black-red, meaning that it's in those exact 2 colors, and it's telling us what this color pair is interested in doing, which in this case is casting non-creature spells and doing direct damage to the opponent. Overall, I think this is a pretty disappointing signpost. The stat line is really, really bad. It means it can die to very cheap spells and can't even block 2-drops effectively. It is undoubtedly nice that it shocks the opponent in the face when you cast spells, and when you combine this with the mage tokens in the set, which are 0/1s that do 1 damage anytime you cast a non-creature spell, there is a real chance to do a ton of damage to your opponent when you're chaining together really cheap spells. But the inefficient stat line here is an absolute killer, even with Death Touch, and I don't really think this is better than a C. Next up, it's Choco, Seeker of Paradise, which for 1 generic, a green, a white, and a blue, is a 3/5 legendary bird at rare. Whenever 1 or more birds you control attack, look at that many cards from the top of your library. You may put one of them into your hand, then put any number of land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest into your graveyard. And it has landfall, which means you get something when a land you control enters. In this case, Choco gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So this attack trigger is pretty good. Even if your deck has no other birds in it, Choco is a bird and counts itself. So when it attacks, you can draw a card. You can also choose to put that card into your graveyard, and if it's a land, you put it directly into play, which will make Choco into a better attacker that turn. And if you have more birds, it gets to be even more potent because you get to look at more cards. You do still only get to draw 1 card from the trigger, even when you attack with 5 birds, but you do get more lands in play and more cards in your graveyard for value, which certainly makes it even better. Choco is a little bit hard to cast, but fixing in this format looks pretty good, especially if you're in green, so I think this is a pretty good card overall. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Sid, Timeless Artificer, which for 2 generic, a white and a blue, is a 4/4 legendary human artificer at uncommon. Artifact creatures and heroes you control get +1/+1 for each artificer you control and each artificer card in your graveyard, and a deck can have any number of cards named Sid, Timeless Artificer. That part doesn't matter in Limited. You can already play as many Sids as you want, assuming you draft them or get them in your sealed pool. And he's also got cycling for a white and a blue, which means you pay the cost, discard him, and draw a card. This looks pretty good to me. A 4 mana 4/4 with cycling for 2 mana is probably already like a C. The stat line is solid and it has the upside of you being able to throw it away if you really need to hit a land drop or something. But then you throw in the fact he's capable of buffing a significant chunk of your deck. So you're going to have some artifact creatures in your deck, especially if you're in blue-white, which is an artifact color pair. And you're also going to have some heroes because those are the main tokens in the set. For example, all the job select equipment make heroes. And if you have one sit in play and one in your hand, cycling one can end up being a combat trick of sorts for those creatures because they'll get buffed out of nowhere, which is pretty sweet. Overall, I just see Sid being able to offer a relevant buff on enough boards and having a good enough floor that I think he's a B. Next up, it's Cloud of Darkness, which for 2 generic, a black and 2 green is a 3/3 legendary avatar at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is a number of permanent cards in your graveyard. This looks really good to me. Obviously, black-green is about getting permanents in the graveyard, and this pays you off for it in a huge way. It's usually going to come down and kill something, and it can scale as the game goes on, allowing you to take down bigger and bigger stuff later in the game, and you're adding a pretty relevant body to the board. I will say, the double green in its casting cost can sometimes be difficult, even in a green-black deck, and there will be times where you can't play it on curve. That'll be kind of a problem, but I think that's a fine downside to have on a card that is this powerful. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Emmett Selch Unsundered, which for 1 generic, a blue and a black, is a 2/4 legendary Elder Wizard at Mythic Rare. He's got Vigilance. When he enters or attacks, you draw a card and then discard a card. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 14 or more cards in your graveyard, you may transform Emmett Selch. Then you have a 6/6 that can attack right away. In Hades, Sorcerer of Eld, it's a legendary avatar. It's got Vigilance. During your turn, you may play cards from your graveyard. And if a card or token would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. So I'm already way on board with a 3 mana 2/4 Vigilance that loots when it enters or attacks. Like, that's a really good limited card that you would play. It's probably about a B. So the fact that this can transform in the late game is pretty freaking awesome. Partly because he helps you set it up, partly because blue-black decks are going to be good at loading their graveyard, and once you do transform him, it's the kind of transformation that is likely to just end the game. He'll transform for free, and then you have access to all 14 cards that are in your graveyard, and you have access to all of your mana, plus a huge creature. So, it's going to be pretty hard for you to lose when Emmett Selch transforms, and when he doesn't transform, you just have a really good creature. So I think he does enough to reach into the lower bomb range. He's not a full-on bomb because there will be plenty of games where he never transforms, but because the floor on the card is excellent and the ceiling is absurd, I think that is enough for it to be an A-. Next up, it's the Emperor of Palamecia, which for a blue and a red is a 2/2 human noble wizard at uncommon. It can tap for blue or red, and you spend this mana only to cast a non-creature spell. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, if at least 4 mana was spent to cast it, put a +1/+1 counter on the Emperor. Then if it has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, transform it. And then it becomes the Lord Master of Hell, and because it doesn't exile itself or any of that stuff, it gets to hold on to all of those counters, and it can attack right away, and that's great because the Lord Master of Hell is a 3/3 legendary demon noble wizard that when it attacks, deals X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of non-creature non-land cards in your graveyard. So this is one of the blue-red signposts and comments. As you can see, that color pairs about non-creature spells, and in particular, expensive ones. That's how the Emperor gets counters and can transform into the Lord Master of Hell. Chances are good that when it transforms, you'll have at least 4 non-creature non-lands in your graveyard, since you used them to put counters on the Emperor in the first place. And then you'll have this large, probably 7/7, that's able to attack and do a bunch of damage. Now, it does take a while to transform the Emperor of Palamecia. You're not always going to be able to hold on to the Emperor for that entire amount of time and get 4 counters on it and then transform it. It's a very real setup cost, but this is pretty good just without the transform effect or the ability to gain counters. And then when you throw that in, you end up with a card that has a lot of potential. The ability of the Emperor to produce mana to cast spells will itself make it easier for you to get counters on the Emperor. Do keep in mind you can only have so many 4 mana or more non-creature spells in your deck without having problems with your curve and stuff like that. So there will be many situations where the Emperor doesn't transform, but it is another one that when it transforms is pretty incredible. Overall, I think that makes this a B-. Next, it's X-Death Void Warlock, which for one generic, a black and a green, is a 3/3 legendary spirit warlock at uncommon. When it enters, you gain 3 life, and at the beginning of your end step, if there are 6 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, you transform X-Death. Then it becomes Neo X-Death Dimensions End, a star 3 legendary spirit avatar with trample and power equal to the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. A 3-mana 3/3 that gains 3 life when it enters is a card you'd always play, so the fact that this can turn into a big tramply avatar is pretty nice. Its power will be at least 6, and even though it's unlikely to survive a swing, it'll trade for something and do some damage. In the later stages of the game when your graveyard's really full, this will effectively just be a 3-mana star 3 that gains you that life because it'll transform at your end step, and that'll feel particularly absurd, but it feels pretty good in the early game too, so I think this is a B-. Next up, we've got Garland, Knight of Cornelia, which for a black and a red is a 3/3 legendary human knight at uncommon. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you surveil 1, and you can pay 3 generic, 2 black, and 2 red to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield transformed, activate only as a sorcery. He comes back as Chaos the Endless, a 5/5 legendary demon with flying, and when it dies, you put it on the bottom of its owner's library. So you get a decently aggressive 2-drop here that helps you do some graveyard stuff and likes it when you cast non-creature spells. That Surveil can help you find more cheap non-creature spells to trigger all of your mages that ping your opponent every time you cast a non-creature spell, while also helping you load the graveyard. And then later in the game, it comes back as a pretty impressive creature. It's never going to feel like efficient when it comes out of the graveyard, but we've seen so many graveyard mechanics over the years where it doesn't really matter that much how efficient or inefficient the ability is in the graveyard when you already have a card that gave you value when it was in play. It's basically just really good value to have, especially if you're flooding out late, you hit your 7th land. Normally that'd be really annoying, but in this case you can say, well, I guess I'll get back a 5/5 flyer that is a very real threat. This looks like another good signpost uncommon to me. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Garnet, Princess of Alexandria, which for a green and a white is a 2/2 legendary human noble cleric at uncommon. She has lifelink, and when she attacks, you can remove a lore counter from each of any number of sagas you control, and put a +1/+1 counter on Garnet for each lore counter removed this way. A 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink is a good starting point, and this can grow itself while also keeping all your saga creatures around for longer, and also it will give you additional triggers because you'll remove a counter, so whatever trigger it is you got on a particular turn, you're going to get again on the next turn, and getting that kind of value more than once is often really powerful. That said, it's not like you're going to have like 10 sagas or anything like that. There aren't enough of them in the set for that to be the case, but you're reasonably likely to have like 3, and even being able to combo off with one of them is pretty powerful. It is a little annoying that oftentimes you just won't have a saga, so she really will just be a 2-mana 2/2 lifelink, at which point she's much less impressive, because when you can attack with her, get a counter on her, and rewind one of your sagas, even if your opponent ends up trading with her at that point, you feel pretty good, because you gain some life and you keep a saga around longer and get some more value out of it. She's also not really helped by the fact that the green-white deck isn't really a deck about sagas or about enchantments. It's more of a go-wide deck, and she helps you in that sense from the fact that she helps keep your creature sagas around for longer, but she still doesn't do a thing that's like super synergistic with green-white overall, and I think that hurts her stock a little bit too. There will just be too many times where she's a 2-mana 2/2 lifelink, and while that's fine, it's certainly not exciting. I think she's a C+. Next up, it's Giot, King of the Dwarves, which for a red and a white is a 1/1 legendary dwarf noble at uncommon. It's got double strike. Whenever it or another dwarf you control enters, and whenever an equipment you control enters, you may discard a card, and if you do, you draw a card. A 2-mana 1 with double strike that lets you rummage is pretty good, even when it's a little hard to cast, and this is a great creature to augment with the very equipment he really likes. Obviously, tricks and counters work nicely on him too. And he comes with some self-contained value because he does have an enters trigger, so he looks pretty solid to me. I'm giving him a C+. Next up, it's Gladiolus Amaketia, which for 4 generic, a red and a green is a 6/6 human warrior at uncommon. When it enters, you search your library for a land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. It's also got Landfall. Another target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. You aren't often desperate for a land when you play your 6-drop, but it is nice that this can grab any land, including non-basics like towns, an important land subtype in this set. And of course, it also tacks on a pretty strong landfall trigger that you take advantage of the turn Gladiolus comes down. Most of the time, +2/+2 in trample will make a difference, and it also makes it so that when you draw lands later in the game, as is always the case with landfall, you actually get something out of it instead of feeling like you're bricking on your draws. Red-green is about lands and landfall, so he fits in really nicely to that color pair. I think he's a B-. Next, there's Golbez, Crystal Collector, who for a blue and a black is a 1/4 legendary human wizard at rare. Whenever an artifact you control enters, surveil 1. At the beginning of your end step, if you control 4 or more artifacts, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Then if you control 8 or more artifacts, each opponent loses life equal to that card's power. A somewhat awkward thing here is that blue-black isn't an artifact deck in this format, that's blue-white. Now, I do think most blue-black decks will have enough artifacts that a 2-mana 1/4 that can surveil sometimes is a solid card, but I really wouldn't count on having 4 or more artifacts very often in blue-black, and I really wouldn't count on having 8 or more. I mean, that's kind of a pipe dream in limited anyway. If you can have 4 or more artifacts around and get to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand even once, Golbez is very much worth the investment, and I think you can probably build around it to a certain extent. There's a chance, since blue does have a lot of artifact cards, that you're in like a blue-black deck that has a surprising amount of artifact stuff going on. And if you end up in that deck, this does end up being a lot better, but it probably is like a C in most blue-black decks, and a B if you have a lot of artifacts. Next up, it's Hope S-Time, which for a white and a blue is a 2/2 legendary human wizard. At rare, it's got lifelink. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent mills X cards, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. So, milling your opponent is very rarely a viable strategy in Limited, and I don't think it will be here. You just won't gain enough life for that to be the case. That said, a 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink is an okay starting point, and if a game goes really long and you have some life gain around, her mill might matter. Of course, on the flip side, you have to worry about enabling the graveyard decks in the format. I'm giving this a C. If she was an easier to cast 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink, I'd give her a higher grade, but you're not going to be able to play her on turn 2 often enough for her to be amazing. Next up, it's Ignis Scientia, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue is a 2/2 legendary human advisor at uncommon. When it enters, you look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a land from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and you can pay 1 generic, a green and a blue, and tap Ignis to exile a card from a graveyard, and if it was a creature card, you create a food token. This looks pretty good to me. Blue-green is about lands and towns in particular, and he helps you ramp your mana in a big way. Like, we see 3-mana 2/2s that let you grab a land and put it into your hand be pretty good in Limited, and this is a 3-mana 2/2 that puts one directly on the battlefield. You don't have all the control in the world over what land it is, but you're going to have one in your top 6. You're going to get a land in play, and sometimes you will actually have a choice between useful lands that produce different colors of mana or towns that you really need to go off. So that means he's a 2-for-1 up front that really ramps your mana. He's going to feel amazing when you cast him on turn 3 most of the time. And then he's also got an okay, albeit not exciting, late game ability that you can use to gain some life, and maybe you have some other value for creating artifacts. So he looks pretty good to me overall. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Genova, Ancient Calamity, which for 2 generic, a black and a green, is a 1/5 legendary creature alien at rare. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to Genova's power on up to 1 other target creature. That creature becomes a mutant in addition to its other types. Whenever a mutant you control dies during your turn, you draw cards equal to its power. So this is a combat trigger, which means you'll get 1 counter most of the time the turn it comes down, and a 4-mana 1/5 that puts a counter somewhere every turn is pretty good. And this has a much higher ceiling, both because if you raise its power, it can put more counters on things, and because mutants dying is going to give you some serious value, and if you're buffing a creature that your opponent really has to kill and they have no choice but to kill it, you're going to end up getting tons of value here. Do note that the mutant does have to die during your turn, so that is something your opponent will play around when they can, but it's upside on a card that already delivers some pretty sweet value. I think it's a B+. Next up, it's Joshua, Phoenix's Dominant, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 3/4 legendary human noble wizard at rare. When it enters, you discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards, and you can pay 3 generic, a red, a white, and tap Joshua and exile him, and then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, activate only as a sorcery. Note, in this case, he does exile himself, so he won't be able to attack once he transforms, which in this case, he becomes Phoenix, Warden of Fire, a 4/4 legendary enchantment creature Saga Phoenix with flying and lifelink. And Chapter 1 and 2 deal 2 damage to each opponent. And Chapter 3 lets you return any number of target creature cards with total mana value 6 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, exile Phoenix, then return it to the battlefield. And it says front face up, so it becomes Joshua again, and you get that Inner's trigger again. So this is amazing. I mean, a 3 mana 3/4 that lets me discard up to 2 and draw 2 is a card I play 100% of the time. It's a good stat line, and you almost always have stuff worth giving up for the chance at something better. And this can transform relatively early for 5 mana, at which point you get a good creature that dishes out extra damage. And keep in mind, you'll gain 2 life off of Chapter 1 and 2 because the Phoenix has lifelink. If your opponent doesn't do something about Phoenix Warden of Fire, they're going to be so far behind, even before Chapter 3, at which point the game is entirely put away. So it takes some time to go off, but because the baseline on this card is already excellent and the ceiling is incredibly high, I think it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Judge Magister Gabrynth, which for a white and a black is a 2/2 legendary human advisor knight at uncommon. It's got menace. Whenever another creature or artifact you control dies, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This has a solid starting point, and it is a legitimate threat to grow, especially in black-white, where the theme is sacrificing cheap stuff, so there are plenty of ways to get value here. That said, it doesn't come with a built-in way to sacrifice stuff, which, the best signposts and commons are often the ones that internally have effects where they are both a payoff and an enabler for whatever it is that color pair wants to do. This is really just a payoff and not really an enabler. That said, the thing that it thrives off of doesn't even have to be sacrificing and the like, because you can just play the Judge, attack your opponent with a couple of things that the best they can do is trade with, and if they decide to trade, you get extra value on top of it because your Judge will gain counters. Even if this had like a 7 generic mana ability that let you sacrifice a creature for value, it would be a lot better just because it would have that late game effect that can trigger its payoff ability. But as is, I probably think it's just a C+. Next up, it's Kefka, Court Mage, which for 2 generic, a blue, a black, and a red is a 4/5 legendary human wizard at Mythic Rare. When it enters or attacks, each player discards a card, then you draw a card for each card type among cards discarded this way, and you can pay 8 generic, and each opponent sacrifices a permanent of their choice, transform Kefka, activate only as a sorcery, so this is another one that can attack right away once it transforms. And that's awesome, because it becomes Kefka, Ruler of Ruin, which is a 5/7 legendary avatar wizard with flying. And whenever an opponent loses life during your turn, you draw that many cards. So this is yet another one where even if it couldn't transform, it'd be really, really good. The discard is symmetrical on his enters or attack trigger, but the card draw isn't. So at worst, it lets you rummage, which, discard a card and then draw a card. And at best, it makes your opponent lose a card while you discard 1 and draw 2. And that's pretty sweet on a 5 mana 4/5 that can do it more than once. Like, even just playing Kefka and then attacking with Kefka on the next turn is going to give you a ton of value, even if Kefka never ever transforms. And there's no guarantee he does, because it costs 8 generic mana to transform him. But once you do, this is another transformation that is likely to just end the game because it'll smash in for 5. Also, your opponent does lose a permanence, although they get to choose, so it's really not that strong of an effect. But you do get to smash in for 5 and draw 5, at which point, the game is probably over unless you're completely defenseless. So I think this is a bomb, just because the Kefka side on its own is probably already like an A-, and then you have this extreme upside of it sometimes transforming and just ending the game. So it's easily an A overall. Next up, it's Kuja, Genome Sorcerer, which for 2 generic, a black and a red, is a 3/4 legendary human mutant wizard at rare. At the beginning of your end step, create a tapped 0/1 black wizard creature token with, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this token deals 1 damage to each opponent. Then if you control 4 or more wizards, you transform Kuja. So it's just a 4/6 legendary avatar wizard called Trans Kuja, Fate Defied. And if a wizard you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage instead. So this will give you that first 0/1 before your opponent has a chance to remove it in most cases. And while that 0/1 isn't amazing, it's a free body that at worst can chump block something, and at best can chip in a bunch of damage. And obviously, the more of those you get, the more impressive it is when you cast non-creature spells, and transforming Kuja makes all of that even more rewarding. And keep in mind, Kuja does count itself, so you only need 3 other wizards in addition to Kuja to trigger the transformation. So there are lots of other wizards in the set, and it does count itself as one of the wizards. And then once it transforms, it's effectively an 8/6 because it can hit your opponent or their creature for 8, and all of your little ping effects suddenly become shocks to the face, which will, quickly end the game. It isn't the most efficient creature ever, and it's a little bit slow, so this one's probably not quite a bomb, but I think it's a B+. Next up, it's Lightning, Army of One, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 3/2 legendary human soldier at Mythic Rare. She's got First Strike, Trample, and Lifelink, and when she deals combat damage to a player, until your next turn, if a source would deal damage to that player or a permanent that player controls, it deals double that damage instead. This is a cool design. Just the keywords on a 3-mana 3/2 is pretty good, even on a multicolored card, but the stagger ability can really wreak havoc on your opponent. Because she has First Strike, that means your other creatures will be doing double damage, and if you have some other ways to damage your opponent, things can very quickly get out of control. She also has Trample, so even if she dies, the fact that she gets in, let's say, for 1 damage is enough to trigger her ability. And it lasts until your next turn, so it even means on defense, it's a somewhat useful ability because your creatures will be able to do way more damage as blockers. Now, all of that said, her base stats as a 3-mana 3/2 does mean there are going to be times where you run her out and your opponent spends 2 or even worse, 1 mana and just kills her. And when that happens, you don't have anything to show for your efforts. That said, you're still only spending 3 mana on this. If it sticks around, it's going to do a lot, so it is still a pretty good card, but she is incredibly vulnerable for an entire turn. To an extent. She is also pretty good defensively. There's a good chance your opponent just can't attack into a 3/2 with First Strike on most boards, especially in the early stages of the game. Like, if you play her on 3 and attack with her on 4 after, having played a 2-drop and a 3-drop, the game's probably just over. So she does have some weaknesses, but the upside is pretty incredible. So I think she's a B+. Next up, it's Lock Cole, which for 1 generic, a blue and a black, is a 2/3 legendary human rogue at uncommon. It's got Death Touch and Lifelink, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and then discard a card. So a 3-mana 2/3 with Lifelink and Death Touch is a nice creature. It can trade for anything, making it a pain to attack into or block, especially because its controller will also gain life. So mix in a combat damage trigger that makes it even more annoying to be attacked by this, and you end up with a quality card that can help you load your graveyard, which is what blue-black wants to be doing, giving it a B-. Next, it's Noctis, Prince of Lucis, which for 1 generic, a white, a blue, and a black, is a 4/3 legendary human noble at uncommon with lifelink, and you can cast artifact spells from your graveyard by paying 3 life in addition to paying their other costs. If you cast a spell this way, that artifact enters with a finality counter on it. A hard-to-cast 4-mana 4/3 with lifelink isn't great, but if your deck has some artifacts, being able to cast them from the yard is. Paying 3 life can be a surprisingly high additional cost, but Noctis does make it less painful since it gains you 4 life by turning sideways in a pinch. I do think this needs a build-around grade, since it isn't like decks that are 3 colors will automatically be able to get artifacts in the graveyard. I mean, it's interesting because, blue-white is an artifact deck in the format, blue-black is a graveyard deck, so you may have the tools you need, but having both of those things line up enough for Noctis to actually be worthwhile is going to be challenging. So I think it's just like a D+ in a lot of decks in the format, but a B if you can really get there on loading the graveyard with good artifacts. Next up, it's Omega, Heartless Evolution, which for 5 generic, a blue and a green, is an 8/8 legendary artifact creature robot at uncommon, and when it enters, for each opponent, tap up to 1 target non-land permanent that opponent controls, put X stun counters in each of those permanents, and you gain X life, where X is a number of non-basic lands you control. So this is a town payoff, and it's a really good one. It gives you a huge body that will stun your opponent's best creature for multiple turns, and note it can also hit non-lands with that trigger. You should hit a creature like 99% of the time, but on occasion there will be something else worth locking down. It also gains you life, and that whole combination of shutting down your opponent's best creature for a few turns, adding an 8/8 to the board, and gaining some life is super powerful. It's the kind of thing that a blue-green ramp deck with a bunch of towns in it is going to want to do so that they can get back ahead after probably being behind for the early stages of the game because they've been playing town tap lands, which there's a whole cycle of in the format. But I don't really think this needs a build-around grade because this is just what blue-green wants to do. Like, if you draft a blue-green deck and it doesn't have any towns in it, you just probably have a horrible deck to begin with because that's what you're supposed to be doing. So this is just like a straight-up B because it's doing exactly what this color pair wants to be doing, and it's a super powerful card. Next up, it's Renoa Heartilly, which for 3 generic, a green and a white, is a 4/4 legendary human rebel warlock at uncommon. When it enters, you create Angelo, a legendary 1/1 green and white dog creature token. And when Renoa attacks, another target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature you control. So a 5 mana 4/4 that makes a 1/1 is solid, and she can offer a big buff to another creature when she swings. It is unfortunate she can't buff herself, though, as her understated body isn't likely to be all that scary when she attacks on turn 6, but because she gives you a 1/1, plus makes another one of your creatures, maybe Angelo himself, into a much better attacker, it's not going to hurt that much if your opponent can kill her outright, and a lot of the time they'll only be able to trade with her, but I do still think her stat line holds her back a little bit, because as an attacker, she doesn't make herself any scarier, so I think she's just a C+. Next up, it's Rufus Shinra, which for 1 generic, a white and a black, is a 2/4 legendary human noble at uncommon, and when it attacks, if you don't control a creature named Darkstar, create Darkstar, a legendary 2/2 white and black dog creature token. So if you can manage to attack with this, you're going to get good value, and black-white can find stuff to do with those extra bodies that it generates. But you're not always going to have a board where this can swing and actually trade, and it's not really worth making a 2/2 most of the time if Rufus Shinra can't at least trade. So there are going to be board states where this is just a 3 mana 2/4, and those do sound kind of miserable, giving him a C+. Next up, it's Rydia, Summoner of Mist, which for a red and a green is a 1/2 legendary human shaman at uncommon. She has landfall. You may discard a card if you do draw a card, and you can pay X and tap her and return target saga card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. It gains haste until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. So this landfall trigger is a nice one, as you do often want to dig deeper into your deck. It is a little awkward because oftentimes what you want to discard to a rummage effect like this is a land, and lands are what trigger this, but it's still a useful ability. Her ability to reanimate sagas is going to be pretty powerful, but it's not always going to line up. It does mean you can discard sagas to her landfall ability and then get them back, but I think it's even better when you can have a saga in your graveyard that you've already gotten value out of, and then reanimate it with her. She even gives the creature haste, so you can get some serious value out of that, and if she brings even 1 back, you're really getting a very legitimate 2-for-1. The bad news is her body is almost entirely irrelevant. It's not efficient at all. You're going to play this as a 2-drop against aggro decks, and they're going to be able to sort of have a field day when they see that happen. So she has a lot of potential, and if she can stick around and reanimate multiple sagas, she can take over games, but I don't think it'll line up often enough for her to be insane. She's just a pretty good card. I'm giving her a C+. Next up, it is Sarah Farron, which for 1 generic, a green and a white, is a 2/2 legendary human citizen at uncommon. The first legendary creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 generic less to cast. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control 2 or more other legendary creatures, you may transform Sarah Farron, and then she becomes Crystallized Sarah, a legendary artifact, and the first legendary creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 generic less to cast, and she gives all of your legendary creatures +2/+2. So, you've probably already noticed this set has a ton of legendary creatures, including many at uncommon. As such, I think it's actually possible to build around this. In most sets, this would just be an F that you could never ever build around because she has a bad stat line and you just won't have enough legendary things to take advantage of it. But in this format, I think it's very doable. You still can't use her if your deck only has like 3 legendary creatures, but if you're at 5 or more, and especially if you have something like Renoa Heartilly, which gives you 2 legendaries on its own, Sarah becomes pretty legit, since she might transform right away and offer a huge buff to a few creatures. Her stat line and the setup she requires keep her from being insane, and I do think she's an F in a lot of green-white decks, but I think she'll feel like a B in a legendary-heavy one. Next up, it's Shantoto, Tactician Magician, which for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 0/4 legendary dwarf wizard at uncommon. Whenever you cast it on creature spell, it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell, and if X is 4 or more, draw a card. So again, blue-red, likes non-creature spells, and especially expensive ones. So the first part of this trigger really isn't that great. Buffing her power just isn't going to move the needle a whole lot. But if you get a buff and draw a card, you're going to feel pretty good. Still, this looks more like a signpost that you'll always play in blue-red, but not one that like pulls you into the color pair. Since the baseline on the card isn't very good, she's gonna be a 3 mana 0/4 a huge chunk of the time, and that's not really where you want to be. I'm giving her a C+. Next up, it's Sin, Spyra's Punishment, which for 4 generic, a black, a green, and a blue, is a 7/7 legendary Leviathan avatar at rare. It's got flying, and when it enters or attacks, you exile a permanent card from your graveyard at random, then create a tap token that's a copy of that card. If the exiled card is a land card, repeat this process. So this is tricky to cast, and the fact the token is tapped means that in some ways it won't impact the board right away, but you're still getting a huge flyer and some token the turn it comes down, and if it's allowed to attack, it's going to do it all over again. I really like that they made it so that, maybe the effect is random, but as long as you have one thing in your graveyard that's not a land, you're going to get a token copy of a real card and not just some lands in play, because the process gets repeated until you hit a non-land. And it does only go after permanents, so you just never whiff with this, and the trigger is just really, really strong, and you also have a huge flyer. The only thing that holds it back at all is being a 3-color card in a set that doesn't have like a massive 3-color theme, but fixing is fine, so I think this will be a super powerful card. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Squall Seed Mercenary, which for 2 generic, a white, and a black is a 3/4 legendary human knight mercenary at rare. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gains double strike until end of turn, and when Squall deals combat damage to a player, return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So double strike is a nice buff, and Squall can offer it the turn he comes down, likely giving you a better attack than you had before. You don't always have a good attack when you attack with one creature alone. There are some boards where it's still just better to attack with a bunch of stuff, but there are plenty of situations where you have a 4/4 that couldn't attack before, and now it can attack into their 5/5 because it has double strike, and that's value he gives you immediately. And then on subsequent turns, it can start reanimating small stuff from your graveyard. Obviously, with double strike, you can even get back 2 things, potentially. So overall, this looks good to me. It offers a buff the turn it comes down that will usually alter the board, and then on subsequent turns can deliver a bunch of value, giving him a B+. Next up, it's Tella, Great Sage, which for 3 generic, a blue and a red, is a 3/3 legendary human wizard at rare. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 colorless hero creature token. If 4 or more mana was spent to cast that spell, draw 2 cards. If 8 or more mana was spent to cast that spell, sacrifice Tella, and it deals that much damage to each opponent. So the starting stat line here is awful, and this is expensive enough that you probably have to wait at least a turn before you get anything out of it. That said, getting a 1/1 for every non-creature spell is powerful upside, and this adds so much more upside when you cast expensive things. Even if you just cast one non-creature that costs 4 mana before he dies, you're going to feel very happy about the outcome. And if Tella sticks around, it can snowball because of all the extra cards. You're going to find more and more non-creature spells to cast, and things will end quickly. And finishing off your opponent by doing 8 to their dome is even approachable. Basically, I can see why they gave this such a bad stat line, because it would be completely absurd if the stats were better and it cost less mana. That said, I do think this needing a turn to really get set up, and a turn where you really have to cross your fingers that your opponent can't easily deal with it, and a turn where you really need to find spells to cast, does keep it from being a full-on bomb. Like, it asks you to do enough stuff and takes enough time that I think it falls below that level of power, but it's really good. I'm giving it a B+. Next, it's Terra, Magical Adept, which for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 4/2 legendary human wizard warrior at Mythic rare. When it enters, you mill 5 cards, put up to 1 enchantment card milled this way into your hand, and you can pay 4 generic, a red and a green, tap, and exile Terra, and then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. So this one exiles, thus when it transforms it can't attack right away. Activate only as a sorcery. In this case, it comes back as Esper Terra, a 6/6 legendary enchantment creature that's a saga wizard with flying. Her chapters 1 through 3 say, create a token that's a copy of target non-legendary enchantment you control. It gains haste. If it's a saga, put up to 3 lore counters on it. Sacrifice it at the beginning of your next end step. And Chapter 4 has you add 2 white, 2 blue, 2 black, 2 red, and 2 green, and you exile Esper and then return it to the battlefield. So this card is kind of dependent on you hitting an enchantment with the enters trigger, and you're going to be happy with your investment when you can. And if you get her in the late game and can transform her, she's going to take even more advantage of enchantments. Bad news is, enchantments aren't a massive theme in this set. You do have the sagas, and there are other enchantments around, but there's not an enchantment deck in this set. So you're not going to have like a super synergistic enchantment deck for the most part. You're going to have a deck that has some enchantments in it. So always hitting something with her mill trigger isn't going to be that easy. And taking advantage of her chapters 1 through 3 won't be that easy either. That said, you can certainly prioritize taking enchantments once you have Terra, because she is incredibly strong when you can get there. But I do think she's probably just like a C- in a lot of red-green decks because she'll be a 3-mana 4/2 that will give you some graveyard value and occasionally draw you a card. But in a lot of those decks, transforming her is not going to be that exciting. But if you do end up in an enchantment-heavy deck with a lot of sagas, she gets a lot better. So I think she has a ceiling of an A-, but most of the time, probably not that great. Next up, it's Titus Blitzball Star, which for 1 generic, a white and a blue, is a 2/1 legendary human warrior at uncommon. Whenever an artifact you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on Titus. Whenever Titus attacks, tap target creature an opponent controls. So blue-white is an artifact deck as we've seen, and there are enough in the set for him to grow, and his attack trigger is always great when you're aggressive, but the starting point on this card is pretty dismal. It can die to very cheap removal, incidental ping effects, and that's especially true until it gets to like 3 toughness, and that's going to feel like a pretty big blowout when your opponent can spend so little mana to kill it. His attack trigger does help make him relevant all game long, like even if you draw him when you're in top deck mode, adding him to the board is likely to impact your next combat, even if you never put a counter on him. Still, I think his shortcomings hold him to a C+. Next up, it's Ultimecia Time Sorceress, which for 3 generic, a blue and a black, is a 4/5 legendary human warlock at uncommon. When it enters or attacks, you surveil 2, and at the beginning of your end step, you can pay 4 generic, 2 blue, and 2 black, and exile 8 cards from your graveyard. If you do, transform Ultimecia, at which point she becomes Ultimecia Omnipotent, a legendary nightmare warlock that's a 7/7 with menace, and when it transforms into Ultimecia Omnipotent, you take an extra turn after this one. So a 5-mana 4/5 with this enters or attack trigger is probably like a C. An acceptable card, but not one you're excited about. But you know how to make this card exciting? Well, how about transforming it and giving you a Time Walk effect after it can also attack as a 7/7 menace? That said, transforming her is kind of tough. You need 8 mana and enough cards in the graveyard, but her Surveil can help with the cards in graveyard, and oftentimes in the late game, this ability will be a real possibility. And this card really eliminates one of the biggest downsides of transforming it, and that is that you spend your whole turn transforming it, but you just get another turn, so who cares? It is hard enough to achieve, and like the baseline on the card is underwhelming enough that I do think she's just a C+, but you know, if the format's really slow and graveyard nonsense is even better than I'm expecting, she will be a lot better. Next up, it's Vivi Ornitier, which for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 0/3 legendary wizard at Mythic Rare. You can pay 0 and add X mana in any combination of blue and or red, where X is Vivi Ornitier's power. Activate only during your turn and only once each turn. Whenever you cast it on creature spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Vivi Ornitier, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So, one thing to note here, it's easy to look at this first ability and think it only adds mana for non-creature spells because it's a blue-red card and its other abilities about non-creature spells, but Vivi can add mana for anything. Now, you do have to get its power above 0 for it to actually generate mana, but I do think that's pretty doable in blue-red where you're going to be interested in casting non-creature spells. It is miserable that he's a 3-mana 0/3 for a whole turn, hopefully only 1 turn. But after that, as he starts to grow, become a more relevant creature, ping your opponent, and produce mana, he does turn into a pretty legitimate value engine, giving this card a B. Next, it's the Wandering Minstrel, which for a green and a blue is a 1/3 legendary human bard at rare. Lands you control enter untapped, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control 5 or more towns, create a 2/2 elemental creature token that's all colors, and you can pay 3 generic and 1 mana of each color, and other creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of towns you control. This obviously needs a build around gray. Even most blue-green decks, which will have towns as their main theme, will have a hard time getting 5 into play, game in and game out. That said, I do think it's possible to build around this because the set has so many towns and ways to search them up. Having access to the activated ability is definitely relevant in the late game too, but I think most of this card's value comes from its ability to spit out tokens, and the fact that it lets your lands enter untapped is good even when you don't have 5 towns because it means your non-basic towns will be entering untapped. So it's probably like a D in your typical blue-green deck in the format, but I think it could be as good as a B+ when it starts spitting out those tokens. Next up, it's Yuna, Hope of Spira, which for 3 generic, a white and a green, is a 3/5 legendary human cleric at Mythic Rare. During your turn, Yuna and enchantment creatures you control have Trample, Lifelink, and Ward 2, and at the beginning of your end step, return up to 1 target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. So the main thing she works great with in this format is the Saga creatures, because she offers them a very real buff, And reanimating those is a lot better than reanimating just any old enchantment creature because you get all those chapter effects and they'll be pretty capable creatures. I do think this card needs a build around grade because if you only have like 2 enchantment saga creatures, you're not going to be that excited about playing her. So she's probably a D in a lot of decks. But I think she has a ceiling of a B+. I mean, once you get to like 4 or so of those sagas, she starts to get really interesting, especially because you just having one in your graveyard is likely enough for you to get value out of it. Like, you don't have to have one in play or in your hand to use Yuna. One can already have been used in the game and you can take advantage of it. And our last multicolored card is Zidane Tantalus Thief, which for 3 generic, a red and a white, is a 3/3 legendary human mutant scout at uncommon. When it enters, you gain control of target creature an opponent controls until end of turn. Untap it. It gains lifelink and haste until end of turn. Whenever an opponent gains control of a permanent from you, you create a treasure token. So this is one of the better threaten effects we've ever seen, certainly at lower rarities. Typically, you need a sacrifice outlet to make this kind of effect worthwhile, but stapling it to a creature and giving the creature you steal lifelink means you no longer have to worry that much about that stuff, as just the 3/3 body and the lifelink swing from their best creature are likely to really make things better for you. Throw in the fact that you also get a treasure if they get their creature back, and Zidane looks really good. It's the kind of top curve that will be frightening in aggro decks, and that's what red-white is. And it's even a good card when you aren't ahead, which is not the case of most threaten effects. So I think this is a B. All right, let's move to artifacts now. Starting with Adventurer's Airship, which for 3 generic is a 3/2 artifact vehicle at common. It's got flying. When it attacks, you draw a card and then discard a card, and it has crew 2. I like the attack trigger here, but I don't really like anything else. The casting cost and the crew cost still feel really overcosted for such an underwhelming body, so I think it's just a D. Next up, it's A tier and Prewen, which for 6 generic mana is a mythic rare legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature has base power and toughness XX, where X is your life total, and it can equip for 5 generic. So 6 to play and 5 to equip is clunky as heck, and this isn't even guaranteed to offer a huge boost by that point. In fact, it's all the less likely to give you a big boost because you spent 6 mana on this and basically time walked yourself, letting your opponent probably lower your life total. Obviously, the ceiling here is amazing, but you need a bunch of life, and you've got to be ahead or at parity most of the time. And because it doesn't do anything other than increase base power and toughness, your creature kind of needs to have some abilities already for this to be a powerful equipment. Otherwise, you just have a big vanilla creature. I don't think this is very good in limited, sadly. It's a cool design, but I think it's a D, and I would be far more surprised if it ended up being better than a D than I would be if it was just an F. Next up, it's Blitzball, which for 3 generic is a common artifact that can tap for 1 mana of any color, and you can tap it and sacrifice it and draw 2 cards, but you can activate that only if an opponent was dealt combat damage by a legendary creature this turn. So Dragon Stormglobe is an exception, but generally 3 mana rocks aren't good in limited. They don't add to the board and they're horrible top decks, and there are a lot of decks that aren't interested in this kind of thing at all. Tarkir Dragonstorm turned out to be a format where most of the decks were interested in it because it was largely a fairly slow format, but most formats aren't like that. That said, Blitzball's ability to draw you cards when you don't have to pay any mana for it is somewhat accessible in this format because there are so many legendary creatures, and that does offset things a little bit. It means once you don't need the mana, you can find a way to cash it in. It means if you draw it late and you don't need the mana, you can just cash it in, provided you hit your opponent with a legendary creature. You're not always going to be able to. There will still be times where this feels like a really bad top deck, and it's probably something that only gets run in like really grindy control decks that are trying to ramp into some of the really big spells in the format, though we have seen in this video that there are some that are certainly worth trying to get to like 8 mana for. So overall, I think this is just a C-. Next up, it's Buster Sword, which for 3 generic is a mythic rare artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +3/+2. Whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, then you may cast a spell from your hand with mana value less than or equal to that damage without paying its mana cost, and it is equipped for 2 generic. So if this didn't have the combat damage trigger, it would be an okay card because the cost of casting it and then equipping it is fairly reasonable for +3, +2. It's not amazing, but then once you throw in that combat trigger, which is going to allow you to rip through your deck, most of the time that kind of effect that lets you cast a spell in your hand isn't very good. It doesn't work out that often in Limited that you have a card worth casting, but because this has a loot trigger, you're more likely to find one than you would otherwise be, so that is something you're going to take advantage of a decent chunk of the time. You're not always going to, and there are going to be times where it's irrelevant because you have a million mana and it doesn't really matter that you can cast a spell for free, but it is upside on an equipment that's already allowing you to loot and make a creature into a much bigger threat, so I think this looks pretty good overall, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Elixir, which for 1 generic is an uncommon artifact that enters tapped. You can pay 5 generic, tap it, and exile it, and shuffle all non-land cards from your graveyard into your library. You gain life equal to the number of cards shuffled into your library this way. So this does very little for the most part. I mean, it definitely has the potential to gain you a bunch of life and rebuild your library in the extreme late game, but a card that does nothing or close to nothing until then isn't worth it. Most of the time, running this out on 1 will make your opponent feel like they're playing against someone who mulliganed because this card is so unimpactful. And that's not what you're going for. I can maybe see a world where this is a win condition in a wacky control deck, but even then, it's the kind of thing that isn't going to work out all the time, even in that deck, so it's probably just an F. Next, it's Excalibur 2. For 1 generic mana, it's a rare legendary artifact equipment. Whenever you gain life, you put a charge counter on it. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each charge counter on Excalibur 2, and it has equipped for 3 generic. So this is a really strong life gain payoff. It's especially nice that the equipment itself gets the counters, so even that when it isn't equipped, it'll be getting better anytime you gain life. And while there are ways to gain life in this set, there isn't a life gain color pair, and there aren't so many ways to do it that this is going to be an incredible build around. It would be a different story where like black-white was all about life gain or something like that, but it's just not. Many decks in this format will have 0 ways to gain life, and while most white decks will have a few, and there are also some other higher rarity payoffs for gaining life in that color, it's not something that will come together very well since it's pretty reliant on a bunch of rares. Excalibur 2 gets particularly good with lifelink and other repeatable ways to gain life, because that makes it so that even if you draw this late, you have a board that can put counters on this. All that said, I do think this is just an F in your typical deck in the format, and I think it can be like a B- in a deck that gets there on life gain, but I don't see that happening a ton. Next, it's Genji Glove, which for 5 generic is a rare artifact equipment. The equipped creature has double strike, and whenever the equipped creature attacks, if it's the first combat phase of the turn, untap it. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase, and it equips for 3 generic. So getting to combat steps with a double striker around can be pretty amazing. Oftentimes, extra combat steps are pretty bad in Limited, but a double strike creature is pretty likely to survive and get in for another swing thanks to that keyword. Putting this on a creature of significant size at all is going to be a really painful turn for your opponent, but 5 to play and 3 to equip is very clunky, and because this doesn't offer any buff beyond double strike, there are going to be situations where the best you can do is put this on like a 3/3 that can still only trade with your opponent at best. Still, the set does have an equipment and artifact theme that help bolster a card like this, and I do think it's powerful enough to make the cut, but it will disappoint you sometimes. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Instant Ramen, which for 2 generic is a common artifact food with flash. When it enters, you draw a card and you can pay 2 generic and sack it and gain 3 life. Well, there's a magic card called Instant Ramen now. What a world we live in. Anyway, we've seen lots of little food artifacts that replace themselves, and they're never completely horrendous. In fact, in some formats they can be okay, like in a format that has a food deck. But this format doesn't have one of those. It does have an artifact theme, and there are a few life gain payoffs in the set, and this can sort of check those boxes, but it's a kind of card you only play when you just don't get something more meaningful. The flash angle's kind of funny, as there may be the occasional alpha strike that you survive out of nowhere thanks to this, but I think it's just a D+. Next up, it's Iron Giant, which for 7 generic is a 6/6 artifact creature demon at common with Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. Even with all these keywords, this isn't going to feel particularly efficient. You just deserve a lot more for 7 mana, like some kind of ability that leaves a permanent impact on the board even when the card gets killed. As is, this is the top curve you run only when you really, really are desperate. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Lionheart, which for 4 generic is an uncommon artifact equipment. When it enters, it deals 2 damage to any target. Equipped creature gets +2/+1, and it equips for 2 generic. So, Without this interest trigger, this would be an F. It's too expensive to cast and equip for such a meager stats boost, even in a set with some equipment stuff going on. The interest trigger certainly helps, as picking off something smaller, shocking your opponent in the face has some value, but I don't feel like it helps it enough to be really excited about this card, even in an equipment deck. I think it's just a D+. Next up, it's Lunatic Pandora, which is 1 generic for a common legendary artifact. You can pay 2 generic and tap it and surveil 1, or you can pay 6 generic and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy target non-land permanent. So this is a really expensive way to surveil or a really expensive way to destroy a permanent. We've seen lots of artifacts like this over the years, and they pretty much always fall flat. They just don't do enough, basically giving you an option between 2 bad cards. Even with an artifact theme and a legendary sub-theme, I think this is just a D. Next, it's Magic Pot, which for 3 generic is a 1/4 artifact creature goblin construct at common. When it dies, you get a treasure, and you can pay 2 generic and tap it to exile a card from a graveyard. Because this dies into a treasure, it's probably not terrible, since it helps you keep artifacts on board, can even fix your mana, but its other ability, which like hates on the graveyard, is really mediocre too. And so is the stat line, so it's not a super impactful card, but it might make the cut in like blue-white decks often enough to be a C-. Next, it's the Masamune, which for 3 generic is a rare legendary artifact equipment. As long as equipped creature is attacking, it has first strike and must be blocked if able. Equipped creature has, if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of this creature or an emblem you own to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time and it equips for 2 generic. This is not good for limited. It's true that making your creature have first strike and forcing blocks can be good, but the creature already has to be pretty big for that to actually be a powerful effect. It does get nasty with Death Touchers. And while it's possible for you to get some death triggers doubled, it's also very, very far from a guarantee. Basically, for this to do good stuff, you need a creature to already be pretty good, either because of keyword abilities or stats, and you need the creature to have a death trigger, and having all of that line up in limited just doesn't seem likely. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Monk's Fist, which for 2 generic is a common artifact equipment with job select, which means when it enters, you create a 1/1 colorless hero creature token and attach this to it. The equipped creature gets +1/+0 and is a monk in addition to its other types, and you can equip it for 2 generic. So this amounts to being a 2 mana 2/1 with some medium upside, that upside being that you can move this buff to other stuff when you want to. It does give you 2 permanents. There's also an artifact deck in the format and an equipment deck, and it kind of checks those boxes. So, this is a 2-drop that you'll play in some decks, but it's never going to be like the 2-drop you're really seeking out or anything. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Poo Poo UFO, which for 2 generic is a 0/4 artifact creature construct alien at uncommon. It's got flying. You can tap it to put a land from your hand on the battlefield, and you can pay 3 generic, and until end of turn, its base power and toughness becomes equal to the number of towns you control. So if you get this early, it can ramp your mana. If you get it late, its ability to put lands in play is less relevant, but it does remain a creature that can be a bit of a threat if you have enough towns. All that said, this doesn't feel like the town payoff you're looking for to me. I mean, I'm really excited and high on the town deck. I always think those themes with lands with subtypes are a lot of fun, but this just doesn't look that good. You have to have mana to pump into it and like a lot of towns in play before it ever becomes a relevant creature in terms of being an attacker, and having both of those things going on is far from guaranteed. And even the ability to put lands in play from your hand onto the battlefield isn't always useful, even when you drop this thing on turn 2, because if you have your 3rd land and then don't draw a 4th one, you're just going to be able to play your 3rd land anyway. So it doesn't really matter. There are a lot of situations where it doesn't matter. It gets better when you're drawing cards. Like if you can draw multiple cards, you can tap it and, really ramp your mana more consistently. But that's yet another thing this card is asking of you. So I don't think this looks great. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's the Regalia, which for 4 generic is a 4/4 legendary artifact vehicle. At rare, it has haste. When it attacks, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. Put that card onto the battlefield tapped and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and it has crew 1. So when this attacks, you're always going to get a land out of your deck, and attacking with it isn't too challenging since it has haste and it's easy to crew. It's not exactly going to feel like a game-breaking 2-for-1, but it certainly gives you some good value, and if you have landfall or artifact stuff going on, it can be even better. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Relentless XATM092, which for 6 generic is a 6/5 artifact creature robot spider at uncommon. Can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures, and you can pay 8 generic and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped with a finality counter on it. I don't love the stats, although the fact that it's super hard to block can be nice, and its ability to return to the battlefield in the extreme late game can be too, but I'm not really convinced that there's significant enough upsides for this to be anything special for a 6 mana card. Sure, you can ultimately get a 2-for-1, and sending it at your opponent is scary since they have to give up so much, but that's only true in combat. There are lots of other ways to deal with this card that are far more efficient, that will feel really backbreaking, so I think it's just a C-. Next up, it's Ring of the Lucy, which for 4 generic is an uncommon legendary artifact that can tap for 2 colorless, and you can pay 2 generic, tap it, and pay a life to tap target non-land permanent. This has some real potential. We don't often get 4 mana rocks that tap for 2 in limited these days, and this is definitely a card that can help you ramp in a big way. And the Icy Manipulator mode being available for when you don't really need the mana is pretty sweet. I think this is a C+. Next, it's World Map, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can pay 1 generic, tap it, and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And you can pay 3 generic, tap it, and sacrifice it to search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So in other words, they're pretty much the same effect, except the second one lets you grab non-basics. So we've seen in the past that having like a little fiddly artifact that makes you pay mana in order to search up a land and put it into your hand isn't that good. It just limits what you'll be able to do in a turn so much more when you also have to pay mana. It does fix your mana, and it's true it can grab towns if you have lots of extra time, but I think it's too clunky to be a card that you rely on for fixing for the most part. I'm giving it a D+. All right, let's move to the lands now. First up, we've got Adventurer's Inn, a common land town. When this land enters, you gain 2 life, and you can tap it for colorless. I like the towns a lot, but not this one. The upside isn't worth it here. It hurts your mana when you play a land that can't tap for mana of certain colors, like in a very significant way, and the upside of this being a town that also gains you life isn't really enough to offset it. I mean, I can see situations where you have every town payoff in the world, maybe you have a couple of life gain payoffs, and then maybe you run this thing, but most of the time you don't. I'm giving it a D-. Next up, it's Balam Garden Seed Academy, which is a rare land town. It enters tapped, and you can tap it for green or blue, and you can pay 5 generic, a green and a blue, and tap it and transform it. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each other town you control. And then it becomes Balam Garden Airborne, which is a 5/4 legendary artifact vehicle with flying, and when it attacks, you draw a card, and it has crew 1. Now, this is an awesome town. Obviously, it's a rare. It's awesome for your mana in blue-green. Like, having a land like this that fixes your mana amazingly in the early game, and then later in the game, turns into a potentially game-winning vehicle that is not only large and evasive, but will just straight-up net you cards, and is easy to crew, is amazing. Like, a land that is fixing your mana, and then also a win condition, is just not something we see all that often. In most ways, I think this is better than a creature land because it permanently becomes a very scary thing instead of only doing it until end of turn. And most of the time in Limited, by the time you're activating your creature lands, you don't really need the land anymore anyway. So you're not going to be broken up about the fact that you have less mana most of the time. And even if this always costs 7 plus tapping this, which is kind of like costing 8, to transform, I would think this was awesome, but it's going to cost less, especially in blue-green. Even if you're paying 6 for it, you're going to feel great, and if you can pay 5 or 4 or anything like that, it's going to be completely absurd. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, this is one of those things that transforms and doesn't exile itself. However, it will be tapped. It'll come, when it transforms, it will be tapped. So you won't be able to attack with it that turn or use it to protect you. So there will be times where it's just too risky to do, but I think the upside here is pretty incredible. I think this is a land that's just a bomb, giving it an A-. There is also a cycle of 2-color towns. All of them are common land towns that enter tapped and can tap for 2 different manas of color, like Baron, Airship, Kingdom here, which can tap for blue or red. These are going to be cards, as always, that you want. Like, if you're in a blue-red deck, you're always going to want 1 or 2 of these unless you're in the most aggressive deck ever, because they just make your mana so much better. Your mana is really bad if you're only running basics in Limited, and that's part of what makes it so bad to play a land that can only tap for colorless, which is even worse. So having these really improves your mana base, but they also help you splash a third color, because if you're like a blue-black deck that wants to splash a red card, this makes it a heck of a lot easier. And then you throw in the fact that it has the town subtype, which especially blue-green decks are going to be interested in, and it's pretty exciting. I think every town that overlaps into blue-green one way or another, because it produces one of those colors, is going to be extra good, like better than the others, because of the town deck. And then the blue-green one itself, probably especially good. But I think these are collectively like a C+. You can value them fairly highly in this format, especially for lands. Next up, it's Capital City, which is an uncommon land town that can tap for colorless. You can pay 1 generic and tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and it has cycling for 2 generic. So this isn't as bad as a land that can only add colorless, but filter lands aren't amazing. Like, it essentially costs you this land plus another one to produce mana of any color, and that is pretty clunky. But it does provide fixing. It has the town subtype, and you can even cycle it in a world where you just really don't want to draw a land, which is pretty nice if you're flooding out, that you can just throw this away and draw something else. But this isn't as exciting as like the 2-color towns that we've already seen, or some of the other ones we're going to see. I think it's just a C-. Next, it's Clive's Hideaway, which is a rare land town with Hideaway 4, which means when it enters, you look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. It can tap for only colorless, but you can pay 2 generic and tap it and play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if you control 4 or more legendary creatures. So even in this set with many legendaries at uncommon, having 4 in play is a big ask. It does get a little easier if you have Renoa Heartilly, which, makes 2 legendary things. But for the most part, this is just another land that hurts your mana base and has an upside that you're not going to be able to access or take advantage of. So I think it's just a D. Next up, it's Crossroads Village, which is a common land town that enters tapped, and as it enters, you choose a color, and it adds 1 mana of the chosen color. So again, really good fixing, and the town subtype. All of those kinds of lands are going to be like C+. Most of the time, this kind of land is a little bit worse than the duels, but it's not always, because being able to name any color is pretty nice. Next, it's Eden, Seat of the Sanctum, which is an uncommon land town that taps for colorless. You can pay 5 generic and tap it and mill 2 cards. Then you may sacrifice this land. When you do, return another target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is another one, only taps for colorless. That's a huge hit, and then its activated ability is just super expensive. It's the kind of thing you only use in an emergency when you have nothing else you can do, and a land where that's the upside isn't worth the downside of hurting your mana base for the most part. So I think it's a D. Next, it's the Gold Saucer, which is an uncommon land town that can tap for colorless. You can pay 2 generic, tap it, and flip a coin. If you win the flip, you create a treasure token, and you can pay 3 generic, tap it, and sacrifice 2 artifacts to draw a card. So this is another one of these that I don't love. It can only tap for colorless, but it can kind of produce mana of any color because it can make you a treasure token, but you have to pay 2 generic mana and win a coin flip to get it, which is, I'm sure that's a flavor win or something. Really bad. It's just not what you want to be doing. And being able to give up artifacts to draw cards can be good, and it can make the treasures to do it, but this is just way too fiddly to be something I want to play. It mostly just hurts your mana base. It's another D. Next up, it is Ishgard, the Holy Sea, which is a rare land town that enters tapped and can tap for white, but it's part of a cycle of 5 towns, 1 for each color, all of which have a sorcery adventure on the other side. And that means you can cast them as a spell from your hand, in this case, Faith and Grief, which for 3 generic and 2 white returns up to 2 target artifact and or enchantment cards from your graveyard to your hand. And then you exile it, and you can still play it later in the game. And oftentimes, because this one's a land, you'll probably play Faith and Grief and then just also play it as a land, all in the same turn, which is pretty good value. And I think the adventure side here is pretty good. By the time you reach later stages of the game, you're going to be pretty happy to cast it. Even just getting 1 thing back when you are also getting a land out of this card is pretty good, and getting 2 things back is really good. You won't always have the things in your graveyard that you need to get back with it, but the fail case here is still that this is a land with a useful subtype that you are happy to run out on turn 1 just because, your deck needs lands. Lands that are also spells are just pretty good. So this one looks like a C+ to me. Next up, it's Jadur, Aristocratic Capital. It's a rare land town that enters tapped and can tap for blue. Its sorcery adventure is Overture for 4 generic and 2 blue. Target opponent mills half their library rounded down. So Not as high on this one, because in most limited games, it's basically just an island with downside. What I mean by that is 6 mana mill spells are rarely going to be something you want to do with your mana in limited, since it doesn't impact the board, and it's not even the kind of mill spell that can sometimes finish off your opponent, because it can only ever take out half. Throw in the fact that you might be helping them with graveyard stuff, and I think this one's a D, even with the town upside and flexibility. Maybe it's more like a C in the blue-green town deck, just because it's a town that taps for blue mana, but I'm not very high on this one. Next up, it's Lindblum Industrial Regency, which is a rare land town that enters tapped and can tap for red. This one actually has an instant adventure. This one's called Mage Siege for 2 generic and a red, and it makes one of those 0 black wizard creature tokens. So, obviously 3 mana for a 0/1 isn't normally good, even with some upside here. But the fact that this is a land that can trigger your other tokens and, importantly, your non-creature spell payoffs before coming into play is pretty sweet. And it does still mean that this is a land that basically adds to the board when you have time to do it, and I like that. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Midgar, City of Mako, which is a rare land town, enters tapped, can tap for black. Its adventure sorcery is Reactor Raid for 2 generic and a black. You may sacrifice an artifact or a creature, and if you do, you draw 2 cards. So I like the idea of having a land that I can cast as a draw spell late, even if it's a draw spell that normally wouldn't be good enough on its own. That's because, again, flexibility is important. This can always be a land, whether you just have to run it out on turn 1, or you cast it as a spell first, which also offsets the fact that you sacrificed something. You kind of draw 3 cards in a way, because you also get a land out of it, so this is another one that I think is a C+. Next, it's Starting Town, which is a rare land town. It enters tapped unless it's your first, second, or third turn of the game. It can tap for colorless, and you can tap it and pay 1 life to add 1 mana of any color. So this fixes your mana really well. And unlike a bunch of the others we've seen, it can't only tap for colorless, it can tap for mana of any color, and paying life is a fine cost for that, and it will even enter untapped early, which is awesome. So I like this one a lot, giving it a B-. And the last card in this video is Xanarkand, Ancient Metropolis, which is a rare land town that enters tapped. You can tap for green, and its sorcery adventure is called Lasting Faith, which for 4 generic and 2 green creates a 1/1 colorless hero creature token, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each land you control. This is the best of these in limited, and it's like not even close, because you would already play a card that was 6 mana 1/1, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each land you control. It wouldn't be great. It'd be like a C, maybe even a C-. But the other cards that we've seen, like only having the adventure side on them, would be way, way worse than that. This would be a playable card anyway, and then it has the land upside. It's a creature that scales all game long. Being a hero has some useful applications. If you're in a ramp deck, it's going to be absolutely huge. Like, it's just a really, really good card, because it's like a creature that can be a finisher and also a land and also a town, and all of that is just really great. So I think this one's a B+. So that does it for the multicolored and colorless cards in Final Fantasy. In the next video, I'll take a look at all the white ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of the rest of the set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to make sure you're all caught up on the set review videos that are out so far, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.